Okay, one more time. Hello, everyone, various waifs and strays, as Dan Howley used to say. I'm in New Orleans, of all places. I am with familiar welcome face, Josh Greenbaum. How you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Good to be here. Good to be here with you.
Yes, so we have commandeered a room. We're actually legit. We got it scheduled, actually, which is cool. Thanks to ASUG. We are at the final day of ASUG Tech Connect, and we are going to debrief the event and find out what we learned. This is kind of an interesting event because it's sprung from a lot of changes, I guess you could say, in SAP conference land. I go back to last spring in Chicago. You and I were actually at ASUG headquarters, unrelated. We were talking about the future of community in SAP, and then we learned that there wasn't going to be a tech ed in Vegas.
Well, we can actually dial even further back, to New York.
Oh, New York, right.
New York, right. So
that was at the analyst thing in New York,
right? An analyst summit, and that's when the news sort of ran across my desk that there was no Tech Ed North America coming up. And, this was following on the Tech Ed North America that had been in 22, which was kind of disappointing. It was, as I jokingly called it, the conference formerly known as Tech Ed. So to find out that there was actually going to be nothing at all instead of some attempt to improve on a mediocre one was pretty much a shock.
Right. And of course, there was SAP Tech Ed Bangalore last week, and there was a virtual event that we were told was very well attended. We talked to SAP directly about that. I think they said 30,000 people.
They felt good about it. Yeah, they said they had good numbers.
But anyhow, so that happened. But when we were in the spring at ASUG, we were talking about, would it make sense to do a different type of event, and it wouldn't necessarily by any means be a replacement for Tech Ed. I mean, the history of Tech Ed, you can get pretty nostalgic about the heyday of that event. That's not what this was about. This was envisioned as a chance to bring together tech leadership to try to make sense of SAP and beyond. And lo and behold, a lot of people showed up. I guess they want to understand this crap, huh?
Yeah, I think the appetite was there. I think that was a nice, moment that we all called it, all of us in that room, that there was actually, there is demand. I think it's a combination of truly, not just pent up demand for in person, but I think we all, collectively sat around for a couple of years, looking at the four walls of our houses and apartments, thinking, what did we miss? And we realized we did miss this stuff. This face, we missed it more than we realized. So I think in addition to the growing need to really understand an increasingly complex set of technology and business choices, people want to actually do that, rubbing shoulders face to face.
Right. And so, this does leave open, I think, a lot of questions around the future of SAP events for technical types. There's a transition that developers, for example, need to make from ABAP to ABAP plus a bunch of other stuff.
Right.
And we could get into that, but that's not what an event like this is for. It's not a hands-on lab for transitioning those skills. I think those kinds of things are also needed, but I think what's cool about this event ultimately is that it turned into a collaboration. SAP and ASUG definitely made sure that this event kind of met the needs that it was proposed to meet, and Juergen Mueller was part of the keynote, and of course, he's a key player in the future of SAP technology as board member and CTO, and we actually talked with him after the keynote, so we're going to share a little bit from that conversation, though I am actually writing an article about that. For those of you that have a huge appetite to digest Tech Ed news, there's a massive news guide online. We're not going to try to cover that in this podcast, but I wrote a 3,000-word article on Diginomica about it if you want to read it, including a lot of stuff we learned about AI. But what we really wanted to do today was kind of talk about taking the pulse of what we actually heard on the ground here. And I guess I want to start by this notion of, why do you think so many people showed up? This seems like a validation that the tech leader of today in the SAP context is facing some pretty momentous issues.
Well, and absolutely, and it's a wide range of issues, and the timing is essential for these companies. They need to, they need to get some of these questions answered yesterday, and they know it. And just to add, considering how late this thing was planned, and the context of the global economy and travel budgets being restricted, the kind of attendance that showed up here was very impressive. But I think, everybody I talked to had a real pressing problem that needed solving, that needed answers. A number of folks said, we listened to tech ed online, but we couldn't ask questions. We need answers. They came here, and they were smart enough to see that need up front and, plan for it. And I think that I think a lot of them, I saw several of them today on the last day, and they're definitely getting the answers they need. They may not be the answers they want, but they're getting the answers. That's good.
Right. And I think that was something that I really liked about this event is I felt I have perceived a pretty good mix between peer discussions. The one downside from peer discussions at times is sometimes you actually need validated roadmap information. And so it was good to see some of the SAP presentations I sat in on, which were not salesy for the most part, but were actually informational. And I think so customers were able to get a lot of answers.
Yeah.
And after the first day keynote, you and I also did a session on decoding SAP, like what the hell is SAP actually talking about? And that was really interesting too. And it was cool to kind of get a sense of the range of where customers were at. But just to give listeners an idea, I mean, when I went into this event, I went in with a totally open mind as far as I just wanted to understand what customers care about, because that's often different than what vendors say from the keynote stage. That's not unique to SAP. That's an enterprise-wide phenomenon. And it's really, really important to get that gut check. So in the hand poll, I forced people to choose between, are you here for S4 or are you here for AI? And it was 98% S4 over AI as a gross simplification. Now, this does not mean that the folks here are not interested in AI, because I went to a generative AI roadmap session later that was well attended. I think what it comes down to, though, is urgency of problems versus roadmap versus perceived ROI and the impact of that. If someone felt that AI was going to solve the problem that they had tomorrow on their project, I think those numbers would have been different. But the reality is that S4 is staring customers in the face. And it was really interesting, too, in the nuances of that, just to see that companies are in a very different place as far as how they're even approaching S4. Some of them are still making sense of it. A lot of them don't have a business case. But we did hear from one customer that was very articulate, not only about S4, but their overall transformation strategy and how S4 fits in. So in my mind, that's the huge benefit of coming to a show like this, is to really understand what other customers are doing. And maybe you need to look at a broader business case around this instead of just saying, well, we have to do it, so we're going to do it.
And, and this you raised a good point. I mean, pretty much everybody I talked to on the customer side showed up here with a real programmatic sort of sense of what they're looking for. Like they've got to fix this problem. They've got to deal with this thing. Those folks that you mentioned, they were one of two companies that I talked to, ironically, on day one, both of whom were in the middle of moving from an AS400 ERP base to S4HANA, which sounds like an incredible lift to me. Interesting enough that there happened to be just two of them, probably more. And they came with a real long list of questions, because that is a phenomenally non-trivial problem to solve.
Yeah.
Pretty fascinating.
Yep. And then you had someone else in that group that was looking at some success factors issues, right? So it's kind of, you had a wide range, right? In their case, they had some public sector / university functionality they're trying to make sense of. Is that going to be something they're going to be able to continue with in the future? Is SAP sunsetting some of that? So, and then also the future of development was on that person's mind. And so, people came with a range of questions. One interesting thing too that I find fascinating around, if I can just make one generalization around the AI stuff, is that it kind of breaks down into two aspects, which is there's definitely interest in understanding SAP's generative AI strategy, but it's fascinating how the AI conversations here always devolved back into data and data quality, and that happened right in our session.
Yeah, well, I took it there, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and one of the attendees too, right? They said, "So, want to say more about that?"
Out, yeah, right. Yeah, I mean that's I was sort of joking when David Wascom introduced us and said, well, I have this question about Gen AI. And I said, yeah, the only question I'm going to answer, because I didn't want to talk about it. But, and my response always, and in fact, now I'm deciding this is a really good aspect of Gen AI, is that whether you're for it or against it, whether you see the business case today or the future, the first thing you're going to have to do anyway is clean up your data. Really do that data governance, data management thing that probably should have been doing a long time ago, in order to be able to have clean data. And like that one attendee said, yeah, we used the data we had and it was garbage in, garbage out. That's what you're going to get. So I think if anything, calling attention to data quality and data governance, master data management, maybe that's, maybe I'll put, be a little more positive about what we're all doing with Gen AI, because that impacts there.
Right. And it's so there's this parallel track of like, well, a lot of the generative AI functionality for SAP and pretty much any vendor is still in fairly formative stages, but like maybe that's okay because there's a huge sort of data prep, data rationalization, data governance thing that has to happen. So get on with that.
Yeah.
And develop some business case results around that, because there's a lot of other stuff you can do with better data besides generative AI.
Yeah, so. And interesting enough, I had coffee this morning with some folks from a major North American utility, and and this guy was not the SAP expert. He's the AI guy. I'm sorry, the BI expert. Too many acronyms. And and he's looking at how do I deal with my data problems writ large, which include a lot of non-SAP stuff. He's here to try to figure out what do you do. He sat in on a BTP session, listened to the DataSphere pitch, wanted my take on how ready for prime time some of this stuff was, and I said not necessarily. And he said, look, to his credit, and I think to SAP's credit, he said, in a way, that's okay. We got a year or so planning to do anyway, but he's trying to sort through all these different offerings from all the vendors who lined up as incumbents inside his company, and this is a good place to go. He wasn't necessarily happy with the answer he got, but he did get an answer, as I alluded to earlier.
So, what were your other big takeaways? Any highlights from your discussions?
Well, I think the success of a conference like this does hinge on the the practical side. There needs to be something for everybody. So this is an ecosystem. You want the partners to be participants. They, quite frankly, help pay some of the bills. The partners felt it was a great show. Every single one of them. I talked to quite a number. Because they had a good engaged set of customers. They understood their job was not to sell. I think they, for the most part, were doing a good job of it. But they felt that this was a place to have an honest and open conversation with SAP and the customer. So I think that felt really good. I learned some really interesting sort of tidbits about for instance how far behind a lot of these S/4HANA private cloud and on-premise customers are in terms of keeping up with the S/4HANA revs and what an impact that has. It's ironic, there we are in S/4 land dealing with the same problems we always had with ECC and R3 on-premise. People don't want to upgrade in a timely fashion. And I think that's an interesting dilemma. And the flip side of it is I went to a presentation by a customer who talked about exactly that process of how they went through and they really cleaned up their act and got huge returns on not just the upgrade, but the data cleanse, and and it literally showed up in the bank because they were paying their hyperscaler X amount less every month just because they had a more efficient system. Full stop.
While we're on the subject of partners, I have a shout out to a partner, Sovanta, Sovanta. Sovanta Innovation Factory for SAP BTP. They're the first partner I've ever spoken with that focuses only on BTP. And I think it's pretty cool because they're upstarts, which is why I'm giving them a shout out. And one of the big issues around this whole clean core BTP sort of transformation is it's a totally different business model for partners. And a lot of partners, understandably, are not there yet. And they made a ton of money on custom code, and that was sort of like how they paid the bills. And so here's a firm that's only doing BTP-based stuff. And it was really interesting to talk with them and also have a longer conversation about why BTP. In other words, because I think one of the things we fall into a trap in these shows is thinking that that's the only way that companies can do these chores. And it's not. Right. There's a lot of different platforms out there. There's a lot of ways to build apps. There's a lot of ways to integrate with third-party systems. And as it's on SAP to show that they have the business content and the ease of use for a developer who wants to build and extend and integrate. And so these partners had some good things to say about the progress that SAP has made in some of those areas. I won't get into the full thing now, but I think it's cool to see a business model emerging. And they talk to me pretty openly about how a lot of partners, they can't do that overnight.
Right.
It's a gradual process, but it's good to see it. And I hope SAP does more emphasis on what you might call next generation partners, which might not all be just BTP based. But I will say that the interest in clean core was quite high. I went to one of the clean core sessions, and it was just overwhelmingly overpacked, and there were a lot of questions. And I'm a bit of a clean core advocate, and that I think a lot of technical debt has proven to be very costly for companies in ways they never anticipated. And that's a topic that I think came out in my discussions with Jeff Scott. I know you're meeting with him today, but I got a couple quotes from him around sort of why he thinks it's so important for a variety of reasons for companies to move into more of a, what you might call, agile sort of approach to IT, and that everything fits into that, whether it's cloud or AI or just basically serving the business. And so anyway, just a lot of interest in understanding SAP's clean core thing. And there's actually a lot of different components to the clean core, like as far as how you get there, that are worth investigating if you're an SAP customer. And that does not, by the way, mean, in my opinion, that you have to then embrace all SAP technologies going forward. It's just that SAP has some pretty good guidelines for how to get to a better place with your SAP footprint. And they showed some pretty convincing stuff in that around a couple of customers, including Hitachi, that basically have made it a lot easier to stay current when they clean up their systems, which is kind of like an obvious thing. But
it's obvious, but there's 50 years of history in the SAP ecosystem for not doing that.
Right. And that's different than capitalizing on new business opportunities for sure. But it's still, to your point, it can have a direct cost impact. So
and it's it paves the way for doing things the right way, and kind of setting up your IT system, your SAP system for to not be an anchor down the road. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. You
I was
first.
just going to say, I'm as you know, John, I've been either bragging or complaining about, depending on my mood. But this is my 6th SAP event in 6 weeks.
Oh my God, dude!
Yeah, I know. I did. That's 4.
You're going to need like a detox, SAP detox.
Yeah, I'm going to a spa. And, I'm going to go on an all no tech diet. But 4 in person, 2 online. And there's some themes that are really emerging, and product. One of the things that's very interesting to me, and particularly came out in a couple of conversations and presentations, is the growing importance of Signavio, and that's that in itself tells me a lot about growing sense of maturity about not just the problem of technical debt, but process debt as well.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, I'm a unabashed fan of Cloud ALM. I think that there's more mention of that here than in previous tech conferences.
I think there's a session on that later today.
Is there?
Okay. If you can catch it before you hit your plane, get you over there, yeah.
I spoke at the Cloud ALM Summit in Mannheim late last month, and I think this is some of the secret sauce that I really think is going to make a difference, and it's nice to have that pushed out a lot more to the customer base, because it's not what you've always done. It's not your typical kind of infrastructure tool, Signavio is changing the game as well. And there's some good stuff here in terms of game-changing technology for managing implementation infrastructure that I think is starting to see the light of day.
Yeah, and I think it will be interesting because I've made the mistake in the past of salivating over SAP's potential. If they could only unite the clans, bring the tools together into one comprehensive offering. And so I'm not going to fall for the cheese just yet on that, but I do understand what you're saying that, and actually this brings us, I want to talk a little bit about our conversation with Juergen, because this kind of came up also. We were kind of riffing on that with him, and
Right.
and to me, what gets really interesting there, because I've been a pretty harsh critic of RISE, in particular, the sort of feeling that RISE is the solution to every problem, which has been troubling to me. It's not that RISE, I don't think, has value. I just think you have to be careful about the force fit part. But what got really interesting in our discussion with Juergen was when we got into that discussion of the tooling you're describing.
Right.
And now you start thinking about RISE not just as a hyperscaler management program, but as an overall way of managing process transformation and your overall footprint around managing that in a cloud context with SAP handling that. And I started saying, if you turn RISE into that type of more business and process offering as well as hyperscaler, then maybe you won't have to sell it. Maybe customers will come to you and say, can you give me this because I really want this?
Yeah, you can build a real business case around that.
And to be clear, Juergen didn't commit in our meeting to go off and doing that, but I think there was a sense that I got from him that they're thinking about how all those things can fit together. So at least they're thinking about how.
Well, and I mean, one of the customer event, talks I went to yesterday, they talked about how they were using Signavio to actually sort of create some KPIs for functionality in specific lines of business, and then benchmarking those KPIs against industry data and really fine tuning the business value of the process using this infrastructure, in this case, Signavio, that's real money on the table. That's real business, user satisfaction and throughput. And boy, industry, if it's benchmarked against industry standards and you're exceeding the standards, you're leading your industry. That's all really powerful stuff. You're right. There's a lot of Kool-Aid that has to sort of be refined into something a little more nutritious to make it work. But it's a good strategy to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. And there were some other cool things that I heard from our meeting with Juergen. Talked more about S/4HANA and supporting customers from a migration standpoint. It was good to hear that his team is still looking at adding even more there. And there's a lot of partners actually right now, along with SAP, that have some pretty good migration tools. But what Juergen was saying that I totally agree with is that customers want as little friction as possible when they make this S/4HANA move from a technical standpoint. So it's good to hear that SAP is working on that. There was also some discussion, and this will be in my piece also, because you and I also met with the chair of the German speaking user group who happened to be here. He was kind of on a New Orleans sort of experienced New Orleans jaunt. I think he was really enjoying not putting on an event because he
pretty much said that flat out.
Yeah.
You can just attend sessions. Yeah.
And there was a bunch of interesting stuff in that, but one of his big concerns is making sure that his members feel they have access to SAP innovations regardless of whether running on-prem or cloud. And so we had some discussions with him, and also I brought this up with Juergen. I have yet to see a single technical reason why you have to be on RISE to consume things like AI. You can talk about RISE from a cloud management standpoint and that it's best practice and all that, but SAP has to be really careful there. And so that didn't get resolved at this conference, but it's a topic you're going to hear more about, because if SAP wants to be the forward-thinking innovation partner, not just the ERP partner in the API data repository for next-gen solutions for other vendors, SAP needs to really look hard at what the user groups are saying there, and hopefully that will happen, and that's going to continue. So, I do think SAP has had a lot of dialogue about this fall, and I've seen some changes in the tone, but we'll see. Anyway, it's an interesting conversation. Didn't get resolved this week, though.
It didn't. You know, as much as we're sitting here talking about Rise, this was largely a Rise-free event. It didn't really get mentioned a lot at all.
No. It was looming, though. So,
Yeah,
for
it's always
example, in the Clean Core thing, they talked about how the rebranding around private cloud is basically known as Rise now, and that set off some flags for me because I can think of private cloud scenarios that should have nothing to do with Rise per se.
Yeah.
So it's there, but at least from an SAP standpoint, they weren't trying to force fit something at this conference that customers didn't want to talk about,
Right.
and that was appreciated. I think I really got a sense of people trying to solve collective problems here. And the other thing I just want to say, as far as ASUG is concerned, is that organizing an event in 6 months for anyone who's ever done a large scale event is really insane. And they did it.
Yeah, you got to be crazy.
And I really liked, there was a good amount of, like, it didn't check all my boxes for creative event design. I think there's more that can be done, especially around more informal peer-to-peer educational sessions and stuff like that. But given the time frame, it was pretty cool. And I'm wearing these like little pins on my badge because they have this personality thing that you could take and figure out what kind of team member you were. I really like that because it gets you thinking about how you function with other teams, but it's the kind of thing to roll out for a last minute conference, very well thought. So, I think it's worth looking at an event like this from the vantage point of what does a customer event look like? And what it looks like is short, fast keynotes, and then lots of sessions, lots of networking, and vendors putting on their own shows could learn a thing or two from this kind of playbook.
Yeah,
I think.
I think it was very successful. Again, I saw, that they had a lot of break times. There's a lot of networking set up, where there was no sessions, where there's, time to mingle, food, coffee not warm enough.
Coffee didn't quite meet your standards this week.
I was, but I'm a bit of a crank about that. But yeah, I think this is, again, I want to really shout out to the ASUG organizers, because having that mingle time, having that downtime where you don't have to rush to a session, but you just kind of sit there and people used it. There was a lot of, my favorite thing I got to do is put these two AS400 transition companies together and watch them walk off and go, I have a conversation.
Yeah, that's pure gold.
And saw them, some of them again this morning, continuing that effort. It's really impressive. I just have to say one thing else to the organizers. We're in New Orleans, and the first day one keynote, we're all, started at 8:00 outside the keynote theater with a breakfast thing and, a lot of tables, people sitting down. And then to draw everyone into the theater itself, out of somewhere in this convention center comes a gospel choir.
You showed me the video.
Yeah,
that looked amazing.
Walking, in their robes. I mean, it was, it was actually a lot of fun, and they sort of led, like, led the attendees into the theater, got up on stage, started singing, dancing, and they had that audience standing up, clapping along to the music. And I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. Just everybody sat down before anything happened at Tech Connect. They were sitting down there with a smile, excited about what was to come. It was a really well, nice little touch. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's treacherous ground for shows, because you can really go, I think, awry with overdoing the entertainment. But in that context, it sounded like it did just the right amount.
I'm the crankiest guy
getting
on earth
people.
about
Oh yeah, I know.
So,
I got a message from you the next day that wasn't quite as
the drum corps was
enthusiastic
a little loud,
about the drums.
Yeah.
So you can go off track pretty quick.
Yeah, and the brass band this morning actually was pretty fun, but the choir did it.
There's one other thing I wanted to point out that I think is interesting, which is that when you think about sort of the next phase of the enterprise, it's that unintentional positive impact of AI that you're talking about, where really forcing companies to play nice with each other in ways that in the past they didn't. And this goes back to one of my favorite posts you've written in the last couple of years on the heterogeneous enterprise. Right. And how vendors want to pretend like it's not, but it is. And this event really picked up on that when in a good way, when I walk into the keynote, and they have Microsoft on stage too. Scott Guthrie is his name, I think.
Right. Yeah.
And they're having a long conversation about the future of AI and all this stuff between SAP, ASUG, and Microsoft. And meanwhile, Microsoft and SAP are competing fiercely in other areas around cloud services and stuff like that for SAP customers. And yet, in that moment, there's a need not just to introduce a partner, but to have a long conversation together. That's the difference between the days of old where you might have a partner on to handshakes and smiles, but this was actually a long thing. And to me, it's interesting, like the future of this, like that we're going to have to learn how to work together and I hope we can get to a day where there's no shame in having, oh, here's a Salesforce example at an SAP show, and here's Coupa over here, and because it's all about plugging it all in the way that the customer wants to do in the interests of their overall plan. And so to me, like when I see that, it's encouraging.
Yeah, not just for the giant, Microsoft-sized custom partners. I think SAP is slowly getting its act together about giving a shout out to some of the smaller partners, the more niche partners, the ones who really make up that long tail of partner functionality that they desperately need. I'm encouraged by that. As you said, I've been really pushing hard at all levels of SAP to recognize the reality of the customer base. They need your help. Every vendor. They need every vendor's help in navigating the complexity that they unfortunately grew up with and are now having to kind of deal with in this incredibly fast-paced economy. They gotta pivot on a dime, with pulling all this technical and process debt behind them, and a lot of it has to do with the heterogeneity in the organization.
Yeah, and along those lines of smaller partners, like a lot of the most interesting imaginative ideas, because back to Savanta, the other thing they had at their booth, and I won't get this description quite right, but you'll like this new app that they built that I think there's some Fiori aspects to it, I'm not sure, but it's basically like it's a project pulse where you take the health of a project pulse based on certain signals from employees, right? Which goes
Sounds
back to
kind of familiar to me.
Yeah, I think you're
I'll
familiar.
Do an IP scan. See.
Yeah, you might want to see if they've looked at some of your past work.
Yeah.
But the point is, like, here's a partner saying we got to take more responsibility for project health, and honestly, that's the responsibility, in my opinion, also of the main vendors, SAP and any other. But it's really cool to see partners saying, here's something creative and different, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to build it. And to your point, if SAP can help to raise the profile of those, then that's great. That's great for everyone.
Yeah, which is what it's all supposed to be about, right?
Yep. Now, you just as we wrap here, you're working on you're percolating an interesting blog post. Can you share with us what you're thinking about there?
So this is sort of the result of all this conferencing I've been doing, kind of ad nauseum for the last month and a half. But what's really struck me is in addition to the desperate need to support the heterogeneous environment, companies really SAP needs to put some weight behind the idea that they are the business process leader, that they understand end-to-end processes, and they can help the customer achieve true end-to-end process productivity and efficiency through the application of their technology. What I found in going from Success Connect and HR, Spend Connect, listening in on the CX Live is that there's too many silos. There's too many silos inside SAP. There's too many silos outside SAP, and in the customer base. And so I'm working on this blog post about how do you sort of reconfigure maybe the conference idea to be able to pull all those pieces together and really have a place where, and this is the key idea, you want to cross-pollinate the ideas that are being put in front of the supply chain VP with those that are putting in front of this VP of service, because they actually have to come together to do good by the customer. What's happening over in HR has a huge impact on literally, on the logistics supply chain, on the warehouse management, because people permeate every single process of any value, and as does customers. So this idea that we have to sort of break out of this mold of line of business conferences and line of business go to market and say, let's let's really sell the process. But in order to do that, you have to get those process owners along that complex process to sit down and see the value of actually the internal integration they need. And I'll add that vendors like SAP and everybody else has to also start to educate their own sales force how to sell that idea as well. Because they're stuck carrying quota for a line of business app and not thinking the big picture that they should be able to.
Well, it's funny because in my last tech post I wrote it was in my SAP CX post. I said that team needs to be embedded into Sapphire because that it's kind of what you're talking about, but this notion of cross-pollination, if you're serious about serving end customers, you need to mix that in. But what you're doing is taking this much further because you're basically proposing to disrupt the entire SAP event calendar, which is going to be fun reading.
Thank you.
Because right now there's a lot of line of business focused events, right? And so you're kind of saying like, let's mix this up in a blender and see what we can get.
And I'm saying let's not necessarily do it in the context of Sapphire because you want these LOB leaders to attend. And to be very honest, they don't necessarily go to Sapphire. I don't think that brand is attractive to them. So you see them at Success Connect if they're HR. You see them at Spend Connect if they're in Spend. You don't see them in these other places. So I am sort of proposing, a radical kind of disruption, and I'm sure I'm going to make a lot of friends.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the reactions inside of SAP to this post. This is going to be fun for me.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's nice to kind of like look at someone else jumping into the ring. So.
Yeah, right. Go for it. Buddy.
How is the water, Josh?
Yeah.
And by the way, just for folks if they're like, when is Josh's post going to be out? You can prime the pump by reading your last post on that topic. Content is the printer, experience is the ink, which kind of sets up this next one. So that one will be a good fodder for now until we wait your next missive.
Thank you. Yeah.
So that eases the pressure on getting this next one out the door.
I'm getting this out soon.
Is it coming soon?
For a while. Yeah, I think probably next week, before Thanksgiving. Yeah. How's that for a promise?
Yes. Meanwhile, by the time you hear this, my post on discussions with Juergen and the event itself should be up on Diginomica if all goes well. But I do got to get home, so that is a project. So anyway, thanks for joining. Until next time, thanks, Josh.
My pleasure, as always. It's a lot of fun.
And for those of you that were wondering, where's Jeff Scott? Because we did this 3-man weave in our last one. We are probably going to do a sequel to that to revisit those topics.
I think that's a good idea.
But Jeff's a little busy right now.
He is.
He's got a show to run.
He still is.
Yeah, all right, dude. Talk to you later. Bye.